This program is sponsored by Shine, a pet food company that features over 40 organic, fresh dog and cat food recipes that give your animals delicious and balanced meals. Shine uses responsibly sourced ingredients and earth-friendly packaging, and they're a certified B Corporation, which means that they meet the highest social and environmental standards. My own dogs eat Shine pet food, and they love it, even my very finicky dog, Curly. Shine has stores in Santa Fe, Boulder, and Denver, and you can order online from anywhere at shine.pet. From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. Today we're going to be talking to an Iowa farmer who started out in journalism and academia and ended up raising grass-finished cattle. That's right after these announcements. This program is sponsored by the Agrarian Trust. Agrarian Trust is charting a new path forward for the land trust movement. They're advancing an innovative and robust model of land ownership in which agrarianism, social and environmental justice, community well-being, and the earth itself are all seen as fundamentally intertwined. They're doing this by helping regenerative farmers and ranchers to secure long-term, affordable leases. That helps to strengthen local food systems and to transform community relationships to the land across the country. Visit agrariantrust.org to learn more. This program is sponsored by the Greenhorns. Listeners to Down to Earth might enjoy the newly released 6th edition of the New Farmer's Almanac, a literary miscellany written by and for working agrarians. This year's volume is titled Adjustments and Accommodations, and it's full of essays, poetry, and images that explore how people are facing challenges and uncertainties on the land. Learn more and order your copy at greenhorns.org. Today's guest is Beth Hoffman. She's author of the book Bet the Farm, The Dollars and Cents of Growing Food in America, published by Island Press. Beth grew up in the suburbs in New Jersey, and she had a career as an agriculture journalist and college professor on the West Coast. But then she and her husband John moved to Iowa to take over his family farm and to put into practice regenerative and organic principles, including grass-finished cattle, rotational grazing, goats, and all kinds of produce. Beth tells this story in her book, and she also goes into depth about the economic system of farming in this country. It's a fascinating book, definitely worth reading. Welcome, Beth Hoffman, to Down to Earth.
Thanks for having me.
So you were a food and agriculture reporter for 20 years. Your husband grew up on a farm in Iowa and always planned to eventually take over the farm from his father. And then you and he did that a few years ago. What was that like for you? You were a college professor living in San Francisco. To make that leap, what were some of the challenges involved also from taking over from somebody who maybe wasn't quite ready to let go?
Yeah, a lot of challenges, which is, I guess, what a lot of the book is about, is that process of trying to have the farm transition go smoothly, which it rarely does, I would think. But yeah, I grew up on the East Coast, and then I was living at the time in San Francisco. We now live about an hour from Des Moines. There were a lot of challenges. I mean, I think moving to Iowa, the Midwest, is a very different culture from where I grew up in the East Coast. Something like 1% of Iowa is public lands. And so there's just not a culture of recreating or healthfulness, to be honest, in a lot of ways that, like California, for example, is very, very well known for. There's also, as the rural communities have gotten less and less people, as population has shrank, there's just not a lot of places to go to meet people. So we don't have like a coffee shop where you would meet people. It's a very different mindset, a very different feeling, which I would say has some extreme advantages as well. Like, I didn't have any understanding that the kind of quiet that exists in rural areas was something that I really needed. It's an actual feeling in your soul, I would say, that it's grounding. It's a really nice thing to not be around human sounds very often. But then on the other part of it is John's dad was here farming the land, had been for about 50 years by the time we came around. He was very set in his ways. He just passed away actually in January. he was an obstinate kind of man. He was going to do what he was going to do, and he's going to do it when he wanted to do it. And us coming in and trying to do what we wanted to do was a very tenuous kind of a situation.
What did you want to do?
This land had been row cropped with corn and soybeans for many years, generations. John's grandfather did that as well. There were also cattle on this land that Leroy was running, and they had had hogs. They had had one of the first hog confinement units in the state of Iowa. So we came in with all of these kind of San Francisco ideas. John had left the farm in the 90s, 80s maybe, gone to college, and then had gone out to San Francisco and was trained as a chef, worked in a lot of white tablecloth restaurants, then was a produce buyer, a wine buyer, then he became a butcher. So he had a lot of food knowledge about trends and how things had changed. He had been in San Francisco really through the changes in food that have made the city famous for food. So he had seen the organic movement happen. He had lived through trying to diversify our diets. And he saw the potential of that. Iowa is, well, I would say in the cities, that's something that's happening. But rural Iowa, there's very few restaurants with fresh food. Let's just put it that way. So we really wanted to not farm commodities. We wanted to not be part of the corn and soybeans game. But we purchased the cattle from Leroy, John's dad, and we decided that that was really what we were going to do, is grass-finished beef on this land, so they never have any corn in their diet or soybeans. And we also now have goats, and we have a very large garden that is being sold more and more as part of the farm produce. We also talked a lot about organics at the time. We have not actually gotten certified for organics. So that was the discussion with John's dad. Here's this, staunch corn, beans, cattle guy. Had seen a lot of tough times as a farmer. And here we were, or I was in particular, a city girl, didn't know anything about anything. And I'm talking about organics, how we're going to do organics on the farm. And yeah, it made for a lot of tension and some good storytelling in the end. A good book came out of it, I hope.
Well, and it's so interesting because you talk about not only the farm that you and your husband, I don't want to say inherited because it wasn't an inheritance process. It was a real financial taking over process. But you talk about the process of bringing that whole new mindset and not wanting to do, feed for livestock, which is kind of the corn and soy game, but really doing, as you say, this grass-fed, grass-finished beef. And that has its own economics. I mean, on the one hand, it's better for the environment, it's better for the animals, the meat is better for people, but there are some real challenges, both economically and in terms of production, that might not be visible to the general public. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this was really one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is that after 25 years of reporting on food and agriculture, I was shocked when we sat down to really do the books about what we were going to make. I was shocked at how little we were going to make. And even in the long term, not just the startup costs were expensive, but the costs are expensive, period, and getting more expensive. When people are purchasing at things like Whole Foods, the old Whole Foods, let's say, there's this idea that there's a premium, I raised this thing and people want it, so now I can tack on this extra money and make more out of it. But it actually is, the costs of raising it are much higher when you're buying something that's organic. It's not just they upped the price because they can. So I guess it's just also that the economics are set up that if you want to grow corn and soybeans, they kind of go together out here, or other commodities in other states, they are very well-oiled machines. It's easy to buy the seed. It's easy to buy the sprays that go with the seed. It's easy to find somebody to apply all of that. There's combine operators that are around to harvest if you wanted that. There's a setup system where you just harvest, you put it in a truck and it drives away and you get a check. That's not the economic system for people who are doing something different from that system. When you're not part of that system, you have to then do all the parts of the system yourself and figure out all of those different kinds of parts. So where are you going to get the seeds for those organic carrots, for example? How can you manage the pests here? What kind of environment do you have on your farm? I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Labor being one of the enormous costs that people don't think about. But if you are not applying a pesticide or herbicide to your crop, somebody's got to then go out and pick the weeds. So there's a lot of costs to it that are, I thought, surprising. And it was one of those things, that kind of light bulb, as a journalist, you're learning about stories and you think, oh, that's interesting. This is interesting. And there just kind of kept being over and over these moments where I thought, wow, I didn't know that. Like, if I don't know that after 20 years, people probably don't know that in the general public. And I also just felt like there hadn't been a book that was really fair to farmers. People who are growing corn and beans are not doing it because they are minions of big business and they are brainwashed and uneducated and out to destroy the environment. That's not what's happening. They're doing it because it makes economic sense. They can have guarantees that what they put in the ground is going to come up. I mean, if you look out, my garden is a mess all the time, right? There's like half-eaten things by bugs. There's weeds. You look out at my neighbor's corn rows, and every single one is coming up. Every single one looks pretty healthy. And it actually is quite astounding. So there's really reasons why people do it. It's much, 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 much easier to just put corn in the ground and be done with it, harvest it, get your checks from the government if it didn't work out, and that's it.
Except the elephant in the room, which is it's not long-term sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that in all cases it's not sustainable. I would say at the levels at which we are doing this, the amount of it is not sustainable. Like, you can't forever increase yields and have everybody doing that and more and more and more and more corn with nowhere to sell it. The price of corn went up in the past year, and now it's already coming back down. The trade situation is not working out in our favor. There's cheaper places to get corn. If you think about, like, you're taking some of the most expensive land in the world and growing one of the cheapest commodities on it and trying to make that equation work. So that part economically isn't feasible. And I would say that, yes, we cannot spray as much spray as we're spraying. That part is unsustainable. But if there were much less people doing it, you could make that work. So I don't think it's like in every case, spraying glyphosate, for example, which is Roundup. That was one of the big surprises. After doing all of this journalism on food and agriculture for so long and hearing all of these horror stories about sprays and herbicides, and then coming out to Iowa and seeing lots of birds and frogs with only 4 legs, it just was very surprising that things were not as terrible as it sounded. I really think there's probably a time and place for herbicides. I'm not going to say that nobody should spray them ever. Personally, I wouldn't want to do it on my land. I think it's the mass at which we are doing it, which is really the unsustainable part.
In terms of economics, I mean, farmers, they're in a tough situation in a lot of different ways. I mean, they don't set the prices that they get for their product. That's set by sometimes corporations, sometimes by the market. They don't set the price that they pay for inputs, for debt, for the price of land itself. You described this situation where there are 4 big meat processors and farmers and ranchers have no control over the price that they are paid for their animals. So these companies can buy the animals for rock bottom prices because they have that control. They're making a ton of money for their CEOs, for their shareholders. Their own workers aren't doing that well and can barely afford to pay for meat, even though they work for a meat company. And then the ranchers and farmers who provide the animals, they're just scraping by, or sometimes they're losing money. And then the government subsidizes them so that there will be meat. It sounds completely insane.
Yeah, it's gotten more and more and more and more convoluted. If you look at any kind of legislation and you're trying to make changes, let's say education or healthcare, right? Sometimes laws get layered on top of each other and twisted around, and we're going to do this, we'll improve that, and then that doesn't work, and we'll do this other thing. And that's kind of what's happened in agriculture. There's a policy in this country of cheap food. You keep people fed. This is a political science 101 kind of idea, right? You keep populations fed, and they're happy. That is really the basic key of running a government. Like, everybody has to have, or as many people as possible, have to have cheap food. And that is what we have decided to do in this country. So in addition to it, you have to think about how we have not in this country had a famine, had a really detrimental situation with food where millions of people go hungry, like in many places around the world. I mean, even Europe can remember a time, there's people alive who can remember a time when that happened. We had the Great Depression, and at that point, these policies were enacted to try and ensure that that wasn't going to happen again. So many of the policies, if we look at them with rosy glasses on, they were created to ensure that we had food. And that farmers, if you have a bad year, you don't lose everything. You don't lose the farm. In the 80s, arguably, that was the situation. And again, like in the past decade, it's become a very large problem of foreclosing on farms. But that's where the policy is supposed to help out. It's supposed to ensure that farmers can farm. What's happened is that it's ended up contributing to the production of certain kinds of foods over others. So because this is set up that it's easy and insurable to grow corn, that's what people grow. It doesn't matter, like right now, I mean, it just rained here, but we've been in pretty much a drought. It doesn't matter. Like, everyone's going to grow corn because that's what you're doing this year. That's what the government, the USDA office has it on their books. You're growing corn, you're growing beans. If you have government programs, that's listed out in the order you're supposed to do it. And then it's a little bit more complicated. Like, it's not just if I grow corn, I can walk in and say, well, it didn't work out, give me a check. It's a lot more convoluted than that again. But at the end of the day, I can have subsidized insurance, and I can have some insurances that I'm going to get paid a minimum price. That's not the same for grass-finished beef. That's not a thing. Although there are things that help us. Last year, because it was a drought, there was drought assistance. So there's things that come in to help, but you just don't have the same assurances.
Right. One of the things that's striking is that there are these subsidies and insurance programs set up for corn and commodity crops, but not for like fruits and vegetables, which arguably are the things that we're supposed to really be eating a lot of. And a lot of the grains are going to livestock anyway, not to people.
You know, initially, fruit and vegetable growers did not want those kind of insurances because it can distort the market. There was thinking that you would make more if the market was dictating how much you made for fruits and vegetables. Now, in the past Farm Bill and this Farm Bill will probably be similar, where there is some insurance for specialty crops, is what that's called. But again, if you want to keep bellies full, the cheapest way of doing it is through things like carbohydrates, it's through these commodity crops. So, most of the world gets most of their calories from rice, wheat, and corn. And so those things in most countries are what is the most heavily subsidized products. I mean, here we also have things like cotton. If you look at the list of what is subsidized, what qualifies, it doesn't make much sense. I'm writing a thing about millet right now, for example. It's the International Year of Millets, actually, with the UN designation. And we have one type of millet that is supported in this country, but only for bird seed and livestock feed. So, there becomes really these small windows of what's covered, what's not covered, and it's all this big political game during the Farm Bill. But there are people advocating for fruits and vegetables, and you can get some insurance for it. Whether a lot of smaller producers engage in those kind of programs, it's much more rare. Like 90% of the insurance products are given to the commodity crops.
One of the many things that was striking about your book was that the economics for farmers, farmers get 8 cents on the dollar of food sold.
Yeah, and that's taking into account the inputs. So I actually just checked that with the USDA not long ago. Farmers are, if you look at like the food dollar, it looks like 16 cents, but half of that goes back out the door for fertilizer and herbicides and seed and what's known as inputs.
Right. And even big farms with the highest yields are getting a lot of subsidies, which means, as you point out, that even the biggest, highest yielding farms, what does that mean? That they can't operate without subsidies?
Yeah, it does mean that. Because, again, if you think about it at any scale, you just can't be in the position in farming where you're putting into the ground something that you have absolutely no guarantees about. Subsidies are created, like I was saying, to ensure that farms just don't go under when you lose everything. If you have a drought, if you have hail, there's so many variables. If China goes to Brazil for corn like they are this year, there's got to be some kind of insurance. So yes, farms, very large farms cannot function without those insurances. I met a young woman who is taking over her family's very, very large ranch in South Dakota. And she said, people think that we're making a ton in subsidies, but as soon as that check arrives, it is right back out the door. That money is, the cash flow problems of farming too, because if you think about it, you're borrowing all this money up front, and you're not going to get paid. You don't even have a product for 9 months, 4 months, however long it is. Then you've got to sell it. If you're waiting to a good time of the year when everybody else doesn't have the same product, like your corn is ready in, say, September, October, but you want to wait until March, you're waiting almost a year to get paid back to pay off the debt. So that's what she was saying. They are always cash short.
So you still have this situation where farmers are making 8 cents on the dollar, 16, but 8 of it goes into inputs. Okay, who's making the other 84%?
Yeah, this is, it's fascinating, especially in the last few years, right? Everyone's like, food inflation, and my eggs are costing $5, and this is crazy. Where's that money going? And you look at the reports of the companies that are selling you this food, and they have literally, many of them, doubled their profits over the last 3 years. CEOs are making millions of dollars more. They are not taking the brunt of this inflationary problem. They are not the ones who are suffering because the food is, our costs got so high, now we have to really cut back in order to continue to supply the American public, the world public with food. That's not a thing that's happening. because the demand is still very high, people will pay $5 for a dozen eggs, and they know it. And that's where the money is going, into their pockets. So this is one of the biggest arguments I like to make, because no matter what you propose in agriculture, the discussion always turns to, well, that will make food more expensive. Somebody just wrote this to me on my blog, that I wrote about Proposition 12 in California, where voters voted many years ago that sows need to have more space when they are having piglets, among other animals that are included in that. I think it's chickens and veal, perhaps. I'm not sure. But the argument was, oh, this is going to make food too expensive. And we're talking about 4 square feet. Like, we're not talking about a huge difference in what the sows used to have and what they're supposed to have now. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The pork producers fought it, and the state of Iowa was involved, and the Biden administration was against Prop 12, and they were all complaining that this is going to really impact farmers in a different state, in the state of Iowa, who are supplying all this pork. And it's going to make pork outrageously expensive in California. And the Supreme Court actually decided that no, people in California can decide for themselves what they want to have in the marketplace. They know how expensive it's going to be, and they've decided that anyway. That is always the argument. If we do that, it's going to make food too expensive. And I think that people really need to think a lot about where the money is going when they go to the supermarket. If the money is not going to farmers, where is it going? And it is exactly going to Tyson, to Smithfield, to JBS, to Cargill, the company nobody knows exists in this country. Nobody's heard of Cargill, one of the most powerful companies in the whole world. They are the ones who are making the money. And people deserve to have food that they can afford. And it is possible, if companies aren't taking home twice the profits that they did the year before. That's just insane.
What do you feel would be a better system, like a more just system to address both the excessive profits that food companies are making and the insufficient profits that farmers and farm workers are making?
That's a really good question. And I, unfortunately, have thought a lot about it, and I'm not sure that there are any real silver bullets to present. There's not really something we can do, which I think upsets people. Like, we all just want something to do and it's going to fix things, right? But in all of these systems that are not functioning for most people, education, healthcare, food, they are really complex problems. And I think that there's got to be such an approach of really starting to turn our resources toward these better systems, but ideals of better systems, right? For example, here, we already have a system with the USDA where we have an office in every single county. We have extension offices from Iowa State. These could be places where farmers could actually learn more about alternatives. Because if you look at a place like Iowa, we have some of the most fertile land in the world. We have, generally speaking, enough water to adequately have crops. We are not having constant fires and groundwater issues and all of that. As we get into a situation where the climate is changing, these extreme events are happening more and more, California is not going to be the place where we can ensure 90% of our fruits and vegetables are grown. This is an opportunity for a place like Iowa. In my book, this is an opportunity for us to start putting more resources in and having more help for farmers to understand what else they could do, and giving some reassurances and insurances for it Having experts that can come out to farms and consult, that would be a start of a new system that could actually work, where we would have diversity in our landscape, we would have diversity in our diet, we would have maybe more economic stability in rural communities where one community could be known for apples and this place is having this interesting food over here that you might want to come travel to. And there's a lot of opportunity in that way that's not being tapped into. And I feel like that would be the beginning of a new system that will take generations to actually evolve. In this state where diets are not good in terms of our overall health, farmers are struggling and continue to struggle year after year. There just needs to be more options, more alternatives for farmers to do different things and to be able to get the assistance they need to do that.
You're listening to Down to Earth. Our program will continue in a moment, but we wanted to let you know about some terrific Quivira Coalition in-person and virtual workshops that are coming up. There's an ongoing monthly webinar series being produced by the New Agrarian Program. It's called the New Agrarian Toolkit, a webinar series to dig deep and level up on a variety of helpful topics. There will be several compost-related workshops happening in New Mexico, Santa Fe, Ocate, and Taos, as well as a camp-out workshop happening in Ozona, Texas, on biochar and soil health. You can find out more about all of these at quiviracoalition.org/events, and Quivira, Quivira, quiviracoalition.org/events. And now back to our program. One of the things that's so interesting that you write about is the two myths that we have in America about farming, and one of them is, you call it the agrarian tale, and the other is bigger is better. Talk about those two. What are they about? How do they affect the way we farm and the way we see ourselves in the U.S.?
So the bigger is better myth, a lot of people are familiar with this, where you need to get bigger. That's the solution to farming, is scale. So no matter what you grow, you got to grow more of it and on more land in order to get to a place where you're going to have profits. As in all myths, some part of it is true, right? If I have higher yields on the same amount of land, that seems like a no-brainer. I can make more money that way. But the problem with it is that it's led to overproduction. If all we're doing is like everybody's got to yield more, because that's the focus with something like corn, then what ends up happening is that you run out of markets. You have way too much supply for the demand. And this means that prices are constantly dropping, which, if you are a Cargill that's purchasing raw material, raw corn, let's say, then that's great because the price is always going to be kept low. But if you're the farmer who's growing, trying to push 200, 210 bushels per acre, you're ending up making less and less. So that's part of the problem with the bigger is better myth. The other problem with it is that by definition, if I'm getting bigger, you, my neighbor next door, are getting smaller. There can't be all of us getting bigger at the same time. So by definition, that theory ends up having less and less and less people in rural America.
So basically, bigger means swallowing up the farm next door.
Yeah, exactly. I have to get bigger onto your land. The other myth, the agrarian tale, this is something that you see for as long as this country's been. Thomas Jefferson wrote about how farmers are basically the best citizens, right? They're like the most virtuous, the most hardworking. They're great in a democracy, farmers. That was the kind of the start of that myth. But today you can see this on Instagram, right? All of the cute farms and all of the happy families walking, holding hands in the field, and they're having a wonderful time. And we've got to get our hands in the dirt, and it's going to be great. But for those of us who are in the sustainable food world, this myth has also evolved to be that we are the keepers of the land, the stewards. We are stewarding the land. We are solving the problems of climate change. We're going to solve climate change on farms. We also need to nourish our communities. We need to have people pay very little for very nutritious food so that everybody can afford it. There is no other job I can think of that is supposed to basically save humanity. We're supposed to save the world, save the planet, feed everybody. Everyone's nutritiously fed and healthy now. That's a lot to shoulder as somebody who is trying to make a living on your land, doing the best you can. And what ends up happening is that people feel such a responsibility to keeping prices low that they put themselves out of business. There's been studies about this. This is not just my theory, but there's actual studies where farms, you work yourself out of working. You get completely burned out. And I see this all the time, even on some listservs we're on, where people are just like offering food for really cheap. We're selling beef at $3 a pound for grass-finished beef. We just love farming and we do it as a hobby. And what that's doing is driving everybody else's prices down because they think everybody should now be farming at this rate. And it's an injustice really to everybody else who's trying to do their best to actually, as a farmer, put food on your own table. So that's really the biggest problem with the agrarian tale is it becomes this ideal people are striving towards that they kind of never can get to. And they end up feeling like a failure. They end up being burned out. They leave farming.
And as you write, it was never even true in Jefferson's time. And the little house on the prairie, that stuff wasn't true either. I mean, it really is mythology.
It really is mythology. Yeah, there's a great book called Prairie Fires about Laura Ingalls Wilder and what her life was really like. And it's astounding what they went through. I mean, they were just like wiped out year after year by locust plagues and I mean, just like crazy stuff. And none of that came through in the show. A lot of it doesn't even come through in the books, but her family was destitute most of their lives, like really, really, really struggling. Yeah, and Thomas Jefferson had slaves. Like, hello, this is who was running the farm. Was not these like virtuous farmers. It was people who owned slaves who were doing the actual work. So the food system that we have today, if you think about most of the companies that are involved, Nestle, Kraft, Coca-Cola, a lot of these companies started in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when there were empires, when the whole game was about cheap land and cheap or free labor, and that is still the case today. The company's Hershey's. It's the same model of trying to make things in the least expensive place on earth with the cheapest possible labor. In the case of chocolate, slaves still. It's a model that people have to wake up to. If you don't think about food in that way, what I advocate for is just even picking one thing that you're going to learn about and buy it from somebody that's doing it right. Just start there. You don't have to worry about every single thing in your house and every single piece of food because you'll drive yourself insane. There's so much greenwashing that you wouldn't actually be able to know what's what. But if you care about it, meat is a really great place to just find a farmer and purchase from them nearby. And you could probably do that in any state in this country. You might pay slightly more for it. In our case, you actually are not paying much more for it. If you buy a quarter beef, let's say, it's cheaper overall than you would for all of that meat at the grocery store. But that's how you could make a small impact on this.
What do you think are the new sort of storylines to replace these myths, the agrarian myth and the bigger is better?
Well, the bigger is better is a hard one because farmers themselves, commodity farmers, are convinced that this is the way forward. I hope that my book, other people who are talking about farming, really, I think as time goes on and those commodity crops they remain really hard to grow. I mean, like I was saying, there's one good year that we've had in the past 12. It's something where the older generation is going to age out, and there's new generations of farmers. I see them at Iowa State when I speak there, for example, where the young people, even if you want to grow corn and beans, you're aware of what's going on. You're starting to learn, like, okay, I got to maybe think about this in a little bit. I got to recalibrate. So I think that's going to be a generational thing, a generational change that will happen in commodities. Although I guess, you look on YouTube and there's story after story about people with their big rigs and their giant combines. So I think that that's a hard one to battle. But the agrarian myth, I think one of the things that has to be safe for farmers to talk about what's not going well on the farm. Those Instagram-y things where, everything looks perfect all the time, I think the public you have to question that. And to ask farmers what's not going well. If you have a CSA, a community supported agriculture, if you've invested in that and you work with a farm and get a box each week or whatever during the summer, I would encourage you to ask that farm, like, hey, what's really like what's not going well on the farm? And allow them to talk about that. It doesn't need to be all doom and gloom. Like, I've had this conversation with farmers where they say, well, people just don't want to know. They just want to know all the good things that are happening on the farm. And I think that the storyline of saying things like, oh, it's really dry and we're struggling with water this year, it's not just whining. You can talk about the larger picture in that storytelling. You can tell people what's the significance of that if you don't have that much water, and talk about the bigger picture. Well, over the next several years, this might be a problem. This means that people, for example, might put in irrigation in Iowa, which might then impact groundwater. So you have the ability to use all storytelling, I think, to talk about something larger than yourself. It doesn't have to be a woe is me kind of a situation where all you're doing is whining. So I think that's what changes storylines, is people telling the truth, people being vulnerable and revealing to consumers what's really going on the farm.
I mean, I think one of the things that really stood out in your book was the importance of relationship building, and a lot of different kinds of relationship building, including farmers talking to each other, farmers and non-farmers talking to each other, the mentoring that farmers really need. I mean, it's like there's all these programs, and you can go to USDA or NRCS and they'll give you forms to fill out and all of that. But what you were really hoping for as a beginning farmer was somebody to work with one-on-one to walk you through some of the difficulties, because there's just so many different decisions to be made, and it feels like it's overwhelming.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, and I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of people think about, in the general public, there's been this push about know your farmer, and I think people want to know their farmer, and even people who shop at farmers markets. The problem is that's not always the farmer. A lot of time at the farmer's market, it's a paid labor person because the farmer's out farming or doing something else. So it's hard to access sometimes. But I think that, yes, it's a very important part is farmer to farmer relationships. And in Iowa, we have the amazing luck of having the Practical Farmers of Iowa, which is a farmer to farmer group that's growing by leaps and bounds. I mean, there's even people who just aspire to be farmers or support farmers, or there's all sorts of people involved in that network now. But it's really, honestly, where you can turn to the group. You can have that hive mind where people can give you information and their experiences and share what works. We had this terrible situation last fall where we fall calve, and out of our first 7 calves, we lost 6 of them. We had stillborns and breech births, and it was a total nightmare. And we wrote to the Practical Farmers of Iowa listserv and just said, is anybody else having this? Like, what's happening? Any advice at all? And the outpouring of support, even from people who said, I don't raise cattle, I don't know, but I am thinking about you right now because I can only imagine how terrible that is. It felt so supportive. It felt like community, where you are in a rural area. There's nobody around, very few people around. To have that kind of support and people sending us resources and talk to this vet, and it was amazing. That is one place. And I also think I'm a member of, or board member on the Iowa Farmers Union. And I've been to the National Farmers Union convention twice. And again, I can't even just express like how important that is, and to be in this environment with all these people who are thinking about these same issues in really deep ways. People really want to know and really want to impact policy, because that's where the Farmers Union comes in, is that it's politically active. We are advocating for particular things, not just like sharing with each other, but actually doing the political work that needs to happen behind all of this. And at the national level, when you're at the convention, it's the most democratic thing I've ever seen, where you have basically the policy book opens for the year and people battle out what's going to be policy for the Farmers Union. The conversations that ensue are so inspiring because you can hear about the same issue from all over the country and how different people are dealing. Like, there was a whole discussion about solar and having net metering on farms and having the Farmers Union have that part of the policy. The most fascinating conversation ensued about rural cooperatives, electric cooperatives, and how they work and how solar would work, and people being for it and against it. Yeah, so I would say the relationships through these kind of formalized networks are really crucial to making change. And especially if we want things like on a national level and we want advocating for different things on a political and policy side, there has to be groups that are very solidly active in a national and on state level.
Beth, is there anything that you want to add before we wrap up?
I guess the part that I just really want to emphasize is that the commodity farmers over time, I think, have really felt like they've been a bit vilified, and that people think that the way that they do things is just horrible for animals, it's horrible for the land. Now, I would say a lot of it where you have these externalities where the waters suffered as a result, and there's been too much spraying and too much water use and all these things. That's a reality, but individual farmers, I think, are much more open to not necessarily like quick changes and doing everything differently, but I think that things are gaining a little bit of momentum. Like, people can't do those things forever. You can't continue to just grow the same things and hope for the government to have your back all the time. I think the food system is a place where we really have to look at and think about what we're supporting and how, and its real impacts. And I think that's happening more and more.
Do you feel like regeneration, like regenerative agriculture and really more ecosystem-based agriculture is part of that process?
I think for a long time when I was doing reporting and I'd go on farms and I'd see all these environmental wonderful things that are happening on this farm, and I do this thing sustainably and that thing. And I kept coming away and thinking to myself, well, if it's so great, really, why isn't everybody doing it? And there are reasons why everyone isn't doing it. For one, the amount of labor to do rotational grazing is much more than most people are willing to put in. To move cattle, move goats every day is hours worth of work every day. So I think that we have to come up with ways to help people do that with less labor. There's something called no fence, for example, which is like collars on animals that you don't have to actually put up the fence and take down the fence. It's all done electronically via the internet. We don't have internet that will support that because we have terrible Wi-Fi out here. But those are things that can be really time-saving and labor-saving and make that something that more people would do. So yes, I think there's much more interest in it overall. When I'm at places like Iowa State, even young people who are interested in growing corn, they are hearing about cover crops all the time. Like, okay, we have to make some changes there. Where the line is drawn and how we're using the term regenerative and what qualifies as regenerative and what qualifies as just something that everyone should be doing, those are kind of two different things, perhaps. But yes, I think there's definitely more momentum. I think more people know the term. Everybody's talking about it. That would indicate that there's more attention.
We did a show a while back with somebody from, I believe, from Iowa State who was talking about prairie strips and regenerating prairie grasses. Is that something that you're doing on your land?
Prairie strips are a thing. I had a lot of reservations about it because if you think about, okay, I'm going to do all this and I'm going to do all this commodity cropping and I'm going to stick this little prairie in the middle of it and say that I'm doing regenerative agriculture, that feels a little bit ridiculous. So I was skeptical, but, it is a great first step. It's not like, everybody should stop with strips of prairie. We need actual fields of prairie.
Is that something that you're working toward?
Yes, we are trying to do that. So we have a few sections of land that are in USDA programs for prairie, for butterfly habitat. But, the mixes of what you need for forage in order to graze on prairie is a little bit different. So that land is kind of a separate thing. And we do graze on it, but just very, very quickly to basically control grasses that you don't want. So you have them go on at times when things are not seeding or the prairie plants are very small. So yes, the answer is yes. We are growing prairie and have a focus on native plants, and we've planted hundreds of trees, native trees, trying to get rid of a lot of invasive trees. And that's where the goats come in. The goats are amazing at destroying the invasive species that are in the forest in particular. They don't much like open grasslands. They are browsers. They eat up. They don't graze, which is eating down. So they like to get on top of the trees and eat honeysuckle, which is an invasive here, and multiflora rose are the two ones that they love to eat and we love to get rid of. And what could be better than like growing meat out of invasive species you don't want?
What are you happiest about the years that you've been on your farm so far, and what are your hopes for the farm?
Well, that's a good question. It's good to reflect. We're in year 5, and for the first time, I would say there's some real changes that are happening that is clear on the landscape, like trees we've planted that are actually almost little trees, and seeing how places that we've grazed has changed the makeup of the grasses over time, or keeping animals out of waterways, for example, and like the impact of that over just this little bit of time. I feel like that's an incredible gift to be able to actually experience and see it in action, and how quickly the land can rebound and how different it is. We've had this kind of drought for the last 3 years here. How different it is for us than our neighbors who graze, like they just stick cows out there and they graze until it looks like a golf course.
Whereas you're moving your
Whereas
cows.
we move them every day. Also with the goats, the impact of the goats is amazing. So that I really enjoy. I also feel like I've moved towards more and more vegetables. And so this year we're part of the local food purchasing assistance program, which is a national program, which has been quite active in Iowa, where we can sell to food banks and food pantries at a adjusted rate where it's then compensated for by this fund. So instead of them being dependent upon excess coming from Walmart, for example, and money being supported to go into that kind of the hunger industrial complex, it's being used to support smaller farms. So we're able to ramp up the produce that we're growing, and that makes me really excited too. And we have a building that we are building that's almost completed that will have 2 bedrooms in it and a small area for very small events and cooking classes and that kind of stuff. So that will be very exciting when that's done because people can visit and, really learn while they're here. So we're excited about that. Just getting more involved locally with the local community, seeing how we can be a part of the community more and meet their needs. I think that's like a great vision for the farm, is having it really be part of the community here, not just the sidelining thing that's happening outside of town somewhere.
Beth Hoffman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It was really fun.
Beth Hoffman is a farmer and author of the book Bet the Farm, The Dollars and Cents of Growing Food in America. You can find out more about the book and about Beth at farmbetiowa.com. You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.